What are we going to do in this video, Brain? The same thing we do every video, Becky. Try and take over the world. With science!
Hello everyone, my name's Rebecca and I'm a neuroscientist here to talk to you today about all things neuro and science. And in this episode we're going to be covering another one of our scientific stories of science. So if you're sitting comfortably, or actually sitting uncomfortably might be mandatory for this one, because we're going to be covering the man, the myth, the father of modern psychology himself, Sigmund Shlomo Freud. Freud was born in 1856 in a little town called Freiburg in what is now considered the Czech Republic, but at the time was Moravia. Interestingly, like many well-known scientists, Freud wasn't born into a family of other scientists, and his father, Jacob Freud, was actually a wool merchant. Freud's family dynamics was also quite complex, with his father being a divorcee who was 20 years older than Freud's mother, Amalia Nathanson. This meant that a lot of Freud's siblings were actually much older than he was, and reportedly one of his closest friendships in childhood was with his own nephew, who was naturally a year older than him. There have been lots of biographies and autobiographies of Freud's life which give us insights into what his childhood was like, including one written in 1988 by Peter Gay, which includes some interesting anecdotes about the cultural and familial ties that formed a large part of Freud's childhood and impacted his later work. One of these anecdotes includes Freud seeing his own mother naked and feeling so jealous of his little brother who got to sit with her that he reportedly wished death on him, which does seem very Freudian. Other tales are more sobering, like reports of Freud and his father facing anti-Semitism, and Freud being none too pleased with his father's response, which he deemed weak and passive as his father just carried on. In both cases, though, there does seem to have been genuine affection between Freud and his parents, with his father later gifting him a Philipson Bible for one birthday, which had an inscription on the front page in both Hebrew and English, which read, "In the 35th year of your age, on your birthday, I brought it out of its retirement. Having reserved it, I send it to you, as a token of love from your old father." At the age of about 4, Freud moved from Freiburg to Leipzig, Germany, and then later on to Vienna, where he spent the majority of his life and where most of his siblings were born. Freud reportedly had an intellectual affinity from quite a young age, but was originally intending to study law at the University of Vienna before he eventually swerved onto medicine, potentially because of exposure to scientific work on the nature of, nature, through a public essay by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who also was the writer of Faust. It actually took Freud a little longer to get his medical degree than average due to his fascination with research, including some of his favourite work with Ernst Wilhelm von Brücke, where he studied the anatomy of the spinal cord and neurons, including generating a way to stain them using gold chloride, much more biological than psychological. Later in 1906, Camillo Golgi and Santiago Ramon y Cajal would win a Nobel for their work using a similar approach, but with silver, to map out the structure of the nervous system, and this involved making just some gorgeous pictures of neurons. I mean, look at that bad boy, In 1882, Freud moved over to the General Hospital in Vienna, where he trained with the psychiatrist and the professor of internal medicine. By this point, Freud was starting to get well and truly hooked on the brain, but interestingly, at around the same time in 1879, we actually got the first lab dedicated to experimental psychology set up by Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig. If Freud hadn't moved that second time, maybe we'd have seen these two powerhouses of modern psychology actually get to work together, and maybe Freud's approaches would have been a bit more scientific. Who said that? Sorry about that. So, how do we go from Freud the doctor and neuroscientist to Freud the psychoanalyst? Well, I think that trail arguably starts just a few years later in 1885, when he headed off on a scholarship to visit French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Now, Charcot is another one of these incredibly influential figures that we just see pass by Freud. He's sometimes referred to as the father of modern neuroscience. There seem to be a lot of fathers of modern psychology and neuroscience. Not a criticism, just a barbed observation. Charcot provided the first detailed descriptions of conditions like multiple sclerosis and motor neuron disease, but at the time he met Freud, he was working on something way better. Hysteria. Now, hysteria is an absolute cracker, the first ever mental health condition attributed to women and believed to be purely psychological and treatable using herbs, sex, and sexual abstinence. Why not go with drugs, sex, and rock and roll? It was right there, people. Charcot tried to treat hysteria using hypnosis, and though his techniques were wildly controversial, they did pave the way for the more scientific understanding of psychological conditions that came later, and clearly had an influence on Freud. If hypnosis could be used to treat psychological conditions, then maybe the problem wasn't with the brain at all, but the mind. When Freud got back to Vienna, he opened up his own neurology practice specialising in hysteria and neuroticism. He also married Martha Benez, who he clearly had a good rapport with, writing in his autobiography that it was the fault of my fiancée that I was not already famous at that early age. After he returned to Vienna to be with her, abandoning his very important and influential research on cocaine. Yeah, it wasn't that influential, to be honest. Back to the slightly more promising neurology practice, and Freud was starting to collaborate with Viennese physician Josef Breuer on potential treatments for hysteria. And it is here that we start to see the foundation of the psychoanalytical approach, the approach that is still the basis of many therapies today. And it all started with one woman, Bertha Pappenheim. Under the pseudonym Anna O, Bertha first sought out Breuer's services to help with her own mental health troubles, which included hallucinations and trouble speaking, and which Breuer obviously labelled as hysteria. He then went about treating her by allowing her to talk about how her symptoms first came about, which he observed seemed to be helpful. Freud actually never met Bertha in real life and would balk at the idea that he invented psychoanalysis, instead pointing back at Breuer, who treated Bertha, and at Bertha herself, who actually coined the term a talking cure. Yeah, the phrase we still use to describe therapies today wasn't actually coined by Freud, nor by Breuer, nor by any psychologist, but by Bertha herself, a hysterical laywoman. Beautiful. She aptly described this procedure, speaking seriously, as a talking cure, while she referred to it jokingly as chimney sweeping. Though Breuer originally based his approach on hypnosis like Charcot used, Freud later went on to develop his own approach known as free association, which is closer to what we use today. Kind of just letting people talk, letting the motor run and seeing what comes out. Bertha went on to be a successful social worker, so successful in fact that she got on a German stamp. But how much of that success was attributable to the psychoanalytical approach is still very much up for debate, especially given that some records suggest she was actually institutionalized again after her treatments with Breuer. As another famous psychologist, Carl Jung, put it, the famous first case Freud treated together with Breuer, and which was vastly praised as an outstanding therapeutic success, was nothing of the sort. Freud and Breuer's academic relationship eventually ran afoul of an issue that Freud would spend a lot of his career talking about. Sex. Also apparently incompatible academic styles, but hey, sex sells and I'm here for the views, so I'm going to mainly stick with the first one. Trigger warning here, if you would not like to hear about all the nonsense that Freud spouted about sex, then skip to this timestamp, because, he had some interesting ideas about how our sexual past can influence our mental health. Let's just put it that way as the abridged version. Hey, you stuck around for the long version! Why? Because Freud's next phase of research really did get him harangued by his peers. And so let's talk a bit about the psychodynamic approach. I remember learning about this in my A-level psychology, which are the exams that we do at 18 here in the UK, and I judged Freud heavily for it then, and I still do, so I really can't blame his critics. It's weird. It's real weird. It's Oedipus complex weird, where everyone wants to sleep with their mothers, and then it's also misogynistic weird, with penis envy. You know, where women are jealous of men because they don't have, well, penises, and then because of that women are essentially just failed penisless men, and therefore all women are morally inferior. I don't know, it tracks in his weird logic. To quote Freud, women oppose change, receive passively, and add nothing of their own. That's nice, isn't it? Helene Dutch, a woman herself and one of Freud's pupils, later suggested much better theories, I'm sure, that women are born just to reproduce. Oh, Friendly fire, Helene! Fortunately, even at the time, these theories weren't particularly well received, including by another female critic who suggested the idea of womb envy to even the scores on Freud, and her name was Karen Horney. But all joking aside, it's actually in one of Freud's responses to Karen that we see one of the most irksome, in my opinion, facets of his theories. We shall not be very greatly surprised if a woman analyst who has not been sufficiently convinced of the intensity of her own wish for a penis also fails to attach proper importance to that factor in her parents. AKA, you can't criticise me, because in criticising me, you're actually just doing that because of your own penis envy, so you're actually just proving my theory. Ultimately circular, unprovable, very unscientific. A lot of Freud's theories fall into this camp of being what we call unfalsifiable. In science, we never prove things right, we only continuously don't prove them wrong. So a theory you can't test is a theory that can't be wrong, but for all the wrong reasons. Take the Oedipus complex. Most people would say, excuse me, Freud, I really don't think I want to have sex with my mum. To which Freud would go, well, it's in your unconscious, so you're not consciously aware of it. Boom, you've just proved my theory of the unconscious. You can't prove him wrong. But of course, when talking about himself, well, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And at the height of Freud's unfalsifiability, we get to see what some people deem his magnum opus, published in 1899, Die Traumdeutung, The Interpretation of Dreams. Freud said that dreams were all about wish fulfillment, a window into the unconscious. So my recurring nightmare as a child where I was being chased by Swiper the Fox from Dora the Explorer was probably a dream really about me wanting to learn Spanish. But Freud didn't believe that certain symbols in dreams meant certain things. It wasn't the case that if you dreamt of a cat, then you should take up knitting. He believed that the interpretation of the dream was dependent on the individual, and so when awake, he'd have his patients freely associate, thinking about what in their lives may be linked to what they saw in their dream. Has this been in any way helpful in therapies? Meh. Beyond dreams, Freud's later work continued to be iconic, with Freudian slips coming from a piece of work he published in 1904, and not even jokes being safe, with Freud later saying that these were another window into the unconscious. Unfortunately, judging from the time period and Freud's religious affiliations, you can probably guess that his work was interrupted for a time by the arrival of a certain dictator and the vilification of the Jewish people. Fortunately, due to Freud's connections with foreign dignitaries, he successfully managed to get himself, his wife Martha and daughter Anna safely out to London in 1938, but 3 of his sisters were lost to concentration camps. Despite this political upheaval and a cancer diagnosis, Freud continued working well into his 80s, publishing an outline of psychoanalysis in 1938. But by this point, Freud called on another old friend, a doctor. And after conversations with Anna, Freud was given a lethal dose of morphine, passing away on the 23rd of September, 1939. And so I'm left in a bit of a pickle, because to be honest, I started writing this video ready to absolutely wail on this guy. I remember hating learning about his theories in college, I hate his scientific method or lack thereof, and I hate that he reduces everything about me down to envy that I don't have a penis. But also, you can't deny the impact he's had. I mean, the unconscious, the influence of childhood on our adult lives, modern talking therapies, that's some pretty fundamental stuff. But then a lot of it's also weird and problematic, and it's not like he's underappreciated. I mean, there are 30 biographies about this guy. There is a real dissonance around Freud for me, and I know I'm not alone here. I've read so many articles that are titled 5 Reasons to Forget Freud and Does Sigmund Freud Still Matter? But also articles titled Why Freud Matters Now More Than Ever. And so I'm back where I was at the beginning of this video, sitting uncomfortably. And I think this actually happens a lot when we dive into the history of science. Because the truth is that the good scientists aren't always the ones that are remembered. And the ones we remember aren't necessarily good people. We can see the biases that impacted their work. And so I'm left wondering if we really are stood on the shoulders of giants like we claim, or just stood on the shoulders of the loudest voices, the luckiest voices, the legacy we can't be bothered to change. Maybe it's inertia, not innovation. Maybe that's why Freud's still taught in colleges. But then I guess, what do I know? I'm just a hysterical woman who dreams of Dora the Explorer and probably unconsciously really loves Freud. That's all the time I have in this video, but if you have any questions about the topics we've discussed today or suggestions for future videos, please do leave a comment down below. Other than that, it's time for me to head back to the lab and plan what I'm going to do for the next video. But in the meantime, please do let me know of any progress you make in trying to take over the world with science!